Kia namasate. Kia namasate. Kia nama. Kia namasate. Kia namasate. Kia nama. Kia nama. Kia. 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 Namaste propakateletamaste. Enemet aftepst katapat katapelebet korpatakadesh. Namaste asamata kaneste terapet katarest katarest namaste. Kokanamaste namaste kanamasta. Kokaramastafte menerste karat. Kokaramana menerste karamat. Kikanamasto karapsatiramsa.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Why Am I Like This? It's November 24th, 2023. We're holding space in a Discord server called The Broom. And this is The Broom Radio. And as I say every time I open the container for an episode of Why Am I Like This, my guarantee in this containment is that no contexts will be enmeshed and context will be disenmeshed, and that if anybody has any reflections on this guarantee or on the container itself, that I will make and hold space for them wherever you want to raise those reflections. And tonight or today, depending on which part of the world you're in, the question which I felt called to raise from the collection of questions which have been collected in the Why Am I Like This container is, I don't remember the exact conversation that I was having, but I was having a conversation with one of my closest spiritual friends or fellow travelers, and the question which I conjured out of the conversation was, why do some of us seem to do okay in a capitalist system and others of us seem to struggle? And I'm kind of curious, before I start extrapolating from this question into a particular timeline, I'm curious if anybody who's in the container right now has anything to say about, what comes up for them when I pose this question to the container. People are typing. Oh, this says so much for me. LOL. Hmm. Mostly what's coming up for me so far is what the fuck. Anna says, my answer feels a bit reductive, LOL, so I'm looking forward to your extrapolation. Well, okay, I'll honor that. Even though I want to hear what your answer would be. Maybe I'll hear about it later. Yeah, like I said, I feel like my reaction so far is what the fuck, because it seems like a question of some vastness. And, I don't feel like I'm particularly qualified to speak about capitalism or alternative forms of political economy. But I do feel like I am qualified to speak about
my experience in capitalist systems and my experience of other people's experiences of capitalist systems, and also my direct experience of what I channel from guides or aspects of my vast self, which is not necessarily to say that what I'm hearing from them is true, but it is to say that my experience of what I'm hearing from them is true to me. And yeah, I feel very qualified to talk about what comes through me, even if other people consider it to be absolute poppycock. Oda says, I honestly feel like my time thriving in capitalistic arenas was a separate slash different timeline slash lifetime. Hmm. Hmm. Ashe and LOL at poppycock. Poppycock. Lexi says, I think of a couple of things like integrity, or lack of it, how people are perceived in this matrix, and ancestral karma, what people have yet to ripen, or how people continue to accumulate it. Seems like a pretty juicy set of coordinates for mapping out the space. Mhm. I wish I remembered why we were talking about this in that conversation. It feels like a juicy, or I want to say like terra. And it's not that I feel like it's not possible for me to regain contact with that context, but I feel like it's being hidden from me for now for reasons that I'm not quite aware of yet. But yeah, I guess I'll say that I can definitely relate to what is said about um, thriving in capitalistic arenas and how that feels sort of like a different timeline or lifetime. And I feel like what Lexi said about integrity, the way we're perceived, and ancestral karma, even though all of those things are, of course, indelibly connected, I think it's useful to think about things through those different perspectives. But I guess I'll start by, yeah, I'll bring into the container some of the other containers that have taken place within Why Am I Like This, where I've talked about my experience of having been very connected to spiritual energy and then having been moved to put all of that aside so I could learn how to be a decent cog in the clockwork or the machinery of the co-created state of consciousness that we sometimes call the matrix or the false matrix. And I'll bring into the container some things I've spoken about with regard to, also in Why Am I Like This, about self-programmability. And then I'm going to open up, if you want to tune in with whatever clear senses you feel are available to you. I'll bring into this container a roughly, 30-meter or 95 feet in diameter toroid, which you can imagine being about 5 meters high, 30 meters in diameter, or about 17 feet high, or 95 feet in diameter. And then, if you feel called to, You can tune into this container, and I'll say that the wisdom of this container in the middle of our container is I want to say a miasma of wisdom codes from the land before it was preyed upon by the egregore of capitalism. And I'm holding space to see if any of y'all have any reflections on what that feels like, what it looks like, whether it's heavy or light or hot or cold, or whether it has colors or shapes, sounds. I guess while people are typing, I'll say the word savage is coming up for me, and the etymons which contribute to the term of savage. Father says, it feels warm and textured as red-dyed linen in my field currently. Thank you for specifying. Tuning into that. Yeah, I guess like what comes up for me when I reflect upon that whole is just like how blood connects us to Earth for many different reasons, but right now I'll say due to the content of iron in our blood and also the content of iron in the Earth. And you know, iron is a metal. Metal tends to be composed of lattices of positively charged ions, which provide what I'll call for now a causeway in which electrons can float freely between positively charged ions in order to conduct or transmit energy between one another and within a network of positively charged ions, or you could say at some level, in order to conduct or transmit information. And I think it's appropriate that you bring up this image because I think it aligns with what I was about to say about savages in the sense that, yeah, the etymons of savage come from, I think, the Proto-Italic for Silvio, which relates to the term of the woods, like the forest. And I feel like what was coming up for me in this container, which I described, which was 30 meters or 95 feet in diameter and 5 meters tall or 17 feet tall, was an image of terra or Tiamat Gaia or earth, which contained many waterways, many trees, many winds, many leaves, many beasts, some of them human. And you could say that these humans were considered savages before the onset of what I'll call like a spiritual disease that we know as capitalism. And going back to the image that Hoda brought up, I'll say that these people were very connected to the earth through their blood, and that they were able to receive messages through the electromagnetic acoustic coupling between their bloodstreams and the core of the earth and the earth's geomagnetic field, which we sometimes keep track of via what people call Schumann resonances. And I would say, like, the word savage comes from, I would say, like, South Central, North Central, and Western Europe. But I feel like people all around the world, from the period, say, like going 300,000 years back up until perhaps at least 15,000 years back, and in some places maybe 6,000 years back. Yeah, in some way were savages, or you could say that they were indigenous. And when I say indigenous, as I've been using the term indigenous for a while, I mean that these people were not separate from the land. I mean that these people were just like parts of the land, just like the way our skin cells are parts of our body. Or you could say our neural networks or our default mode networks, which exist amongst the grey matter of our brains, are part of our body too. But just as it's possible for our skin cells to become inflamed or alienated from our body, or just as it's possible for the ideas that form in the grey matter of our brains, which are parts of our body, can become estranged from or indeed antagonistic to the health of our bodies. I would say that the same has happened with humans in regard to Earth, in the sense that I would say that the onset of capitalism as an ideology, or a spiritual disease, or a thought form complex, or a virus, resulted in the alienation of humans from the earth that they are part of and were once electromagnetically, acoustically coupled to, and also resulted in the antagonism between humans and earth. And yeah, I'd like to hold space there for a second to see if anything's coming up. Seeing chills and emoji reacts, which indicate some level of like pain or resonance with this topic, and just containing that before I move on. So a few times in the past like month or so, I've talked about the difference between colonization and colonialism. Funnily enough, today I was reading the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. I'm up to the third book, which is called Blue Mars. And one of the characters was talking about the difference between totalization and totalitarianism. And I feel like, if y'all are adept or have propensity for abstract pattern matching, you might jump towards pondering upon the difference between capitalization and capitalism. What it says, I'm feeling these causeways, as I put it, or as you put it, open up in the field. But yes, I'm curious, like, what kind of comes up when I put into the container this constellation of totalization versus totalitarianism, capitalization versus capitalism, and colonialization versus colonialism. Also, feel free to unmute if you find it more joyful. right now I'm just like listening to my own voice and a little bit of the wind outside, and then persistently, I'd say my vaster self has been playing a song by Bad Bunny called Titi Me Pregunto. Um, just some very provocative lyrics, I would say. So, which is all to say that any incursion into the sonic space, either inside my head or outside of my head, would be welcome. Or it says, one feels like an answer to direct need. Woof! Woof! Thank you. The other feels like an answer to a hunger, if that makes sense. Wow. That slaps and it feels aligned for me. So, like, when I think about capitalization versus capitalism, I would say the left-hand side, or capitalization, to me probably relates to what you're saying about an answer to a direct need. And then capitalism, I feel like, probably feels a little closer to what you're gesturing at when you say the other feels like an answer to a hunger. And I guess I'll expand upon that by saying that for me, the difference between capital and non-capital gestures at the sense that in any context, there are things that our bodies need, and there are things that our bodies don't need. And the things that our bodies need in that context are capital, or could be referred to as capital. And the things that our bodies don't need in that context could be referred to as non capital. And not often, but not always, the things that we don't need in each context for our bodies can obstruct our bodies from having what they do need. So I think like that, for me, seems to be what you're gesturing at when you say that there's an answer to a direct need. And then, yeah, I would say that when we talk about capitalism as an answer to a hunger, I would say that this relates to taking contexts where we needed something for our bodies and smearing them all over other contexts so that it becomes difficult for us to discern truly what our bodies need in those other contexts, because the need that our bodies had for a form of capital in a different context than a present context ends up overly influencing what we feel like we need in the present context. And I would say that that tends to happen because of a process which I've been calling context enmeshment, which I don't think anybody else has referred to independently. So I feel somewhat comfortable in setting up shop in the semantic space of context enmeshment. And I would say that context enmeshment tends to happen when our nervous systems become dysregulated, which tends to happen when our bodies aren't getting enough of what they need, and we don't have the spiritual capacity to sustain nervous system regulation despite the lack of something. As a tangent, I'll say this is why I fast, and this is my sense of why many lineages are called to fast at different times, so that we can spiritually gain capacity for dealing with the absence of things that we either think we need or we actually need. And yeah, I would say, going back to the somewhat linear extrapolation that I was proceeding upon before I started talking about fasting, I would say that, to make it a little more concrete and simple, that we tend to think that we need something in a present context when we've been deprived of it, or we've had an excess of it in a different context, and where that deprivation or that overabundance of that thing in a different context led to nervous system dysregulation. And I would say that it's probably plausible or tractable for y'all to understand capitalism in this light, right? Where I would say that not only do we assign value to things and assign like a lack of value to things, but I would say that we overly assign value to things based on the context that we're in, and we overly devalue certain things based on the context that we're in due to this smearing of context, which relates to having had too much or too little of a thing in a different context. And I would say that this also extends beyond the context that our bodies have been in, and ends up being influenced by the experiences of our ancestors in the earth and the sky. Hmm. And I would say that's, in some sense, about as primary of a definition of capitalism that I feel called to give. But I would say that like some of the secondary or tertiary effects of that are that we, not only that we assign value to certain things outside of the context in which they're actually valuable, but that we use the value of those things in order to accumulate more of those things, even though those things are not inherently valuable in a given context, and then the things that we accumulate with those things are also not inherently valuable in a given context. And then I would say the steady state or the equilibrium effect of this is that because we are separate beings, and because we are used to defining the value of something based on how we perceive other people to value it, we end up gravitationally being attracted to the hoarding or the accumulation of things that are not inherently valuable in any given context, based on the projection that other people will find them inherently valuable even when they're not inherently valuable in a given context. And that this happens to the detriment not only of the things which are actually valuable to each and every being in each and every context, but that it happens to the detriment of connection between people in any given context, due to a fixation on how those interactions can be used to maximize the accumulation of things which are not inherently valuable to a given context, aka money, aka property, aka social capital, which is, I would say, the stored value of our relationships based on the history of interactions within a relationship and the various projections upon future interactions within those relationships. I would say that for me, those are kind of the big three forms of capital, which we end up being karmically drawn to accumulating or hoarding, regardless of the context that we're in. And yeah, I'll just hold space to see if anybody has any reflections on that too. I do plan to get back to the original question, which was not an original question, but was a statement of a question which I felt was curious about the conversation I was having with my friend. And that question was, why do some people get on better than other people within systems of capitalism? And even as I'm stating this question again within the context of what I've shared so far and what has been shared by the other people in this container so far, I feel it's not going to be an easy transition. So, kind of looking at the distance between where we are now and where we might feel called to go in order to answer this question, there's a little bit of trepidation. So I'm dismembering that.
Can I offer a bridge to get us there?
No,
Oh.
please do.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that as you were speaking on like the three different, I guess, like nodal points that
Mm,
point to like resources that are like portable, um,
mm,
I was just kind of wondering if maybe you or anyone else could like draw a bridge to or from
mm,
how that relates to the basic model of like greed being a deadly sin, so to speak.
mm,
And I put deadly sin in air quotes.
mhm,
Um, but I have been also wrestling with this egregore in my own life and have been called to kind of, yeah, just not only look at my own relationship to my resources, but the general social climate about what resources are, or
mm,
even the egregore. I'll go even further of like what it means to be resource. Mm.
mm. Wow.
I'm like, I can't tell if we took a giant step back or forward or diagonal towards the
Mm.
question, but I hope we can see it more clearly now.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you brought in the egregore of being resource because I feel like this is an egregore which is mostly alive in spiritual communities.
Definitely.
And it's like, yeah, you think that in spiritual communities that people would be perhaps closer to piercing egregores around hoarding or accumulation of resources. But instead, I feel like, yeah, I think it would not be completely ungenerous to say that the egregore of being resourced ends up being used not only as an obstruction to piercing egregores around accumulation of resources, but as an excuse to accumulate more resources outside of context.
Mm,
Please disagree.
yeah, that lines up for me.
Um, but yeah, I guess yeah, I'd say like the question I heard was like, how do these three forms of capital or nodal points, which I like, I liked what, yeah, I think we're fans of cymatics, we're fans of acoustics, right? So we understand that like I'll say that there's all these different energies and perspectives and choices that people make, which end up kind of piling up. And then when we look at those piles, we get something like money, and we get like property, and we get social capital in this, in at least in my perspective. And yeah, like all of these things are different in different contexts, right? So like in Turkey, money is Turkish lira, and in the US, money is the US dollar. But then like, I would say in like many offices or home offices in San Francisco, the money is cryptocurrency, which is basically data, um, which can be seen to conform to a certain format, which is difficult to replicate, which allows us to define that piece of data as something which has some form of value. Um, and yeah, like what's property, right? Like you could have like a gigantic piece of land in the desert and it would have less property value than perhaps 500 square meters in a relatively abundant country like, yeah, like the southwest of Australia, which is where I am now. Um, yeah, and then to move on just quickly to the concept, or yeah, of social capital, I'd say, yeah, there are contexts where you might be having a conversation with somebody, and then there's no other conversation that you could have. You might be alone, you might be waiting for a bus in the middle of an industrial suburb in a city which is highly polluted, and that interaction might feel really valuable in that moment. But then if you're sitting at home and you're trying to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, and somebody's like trying to get on the phone to have the exact same conversation, it might feel not only like not so valuable in that context, but actually like negative in value. Um, so yeah, I think when you say that, yeah, when you describe these different forms of capital as nodal points, I feel like it speaks to the idea that the value of any material thing or material interaction or event could vacillate based on the context that we're in. But then again, to speak to the idea of nodal points, I would say that across different contexts, they end up acquiring a perception of being fixed as high value, even if we are in contexts where it's not super valuable. So going back to like, this conversation that you might be having about something, it's like, yeah, maybe you're at dinner with your wife or your kids or both of them or your husband or whatever, your partner, which is the politically correct way to refer to the person you're trying to build a family with, perhaps. And you might feel like the conversation which is blowing up your phone is more valuable than it actually is in that context, because there were times where you were having similar conversations in places or in moments where you didn't have so much else going on. And then because that value ends up being fixed regardless of the context, you end up perhaps blowing off a more valuable interaction with the people who are in space and time with you, in order to have a conversation with somebody who's not in the same space and time as you. And that's not to say that the conversations that you're going to have with the people who are in the same space and time as you are necessarily more valuable than the conversations that you could be having outside of the space and time that you're in. But it is to say that it's possible, and I would say perhaps a little more likely than not, to find that people are, prioritizing their phone instead of the people that they're with at any given time. Um, but yeah, to go back to like the question within the question frame, um, of like, how do these three nodal points relate to the cardinal sin? I don't know if it's a cardinal sin. Yeah, I think it's a cardinal sin. One of the seven sins, right? Which we call greed. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's like, how should I put it without being overly duplicative while still touching upon things which have been said before in order to give credit to them? I would say that we end up accumulating a lot of things that we don't need because of a misperception of their value based on the context. And then we end up shunning things that we do actually need because of a misperception of the value of those things based on the perception of the value of other things. And I feel like that's a pretty decent working definition of greed. And to extend it to the concept of sin, I feel like the egregore of sin is that if you sin, you're a bad person and you're going to hell. Like, you've done something wrong you've done something that perhaps hurts other people. You've done something that, the Sky Daddy or any of the Sky Daddy's minions, which we sometimes refer to as angels or archangels, might be unhappy about. That's what makes something a sin. But I would say that within the constellation of concepts that we've introduced to this container, that a sin is merely a misperception of value to oneself, and by extension of that, a misperception of the value of one's own being to other people based on a misperception of what's valuable to oneself. And it's like underlining what I said about Sky Daddy minions. Yeah, I mean, I think if you've listened to me for a while now, you probably understand that I'm pretty antagonistic towards angels. So I'm just going to take a step back a little bit, etherically and astrally. And with the 12 remaining minutes of this container, I will attempt to answer the question which perhaps nobody else is interested in apart from myself. But the question again is, why is it that some people are okay within systems which might be described as capitalistic and some are not? Well, I feel like the simple answer to this question would be that some people end up accumulating forms of capital which are inappropriate for the context that they're in, and others remain able to accumulate capital on some time frame of accumulation and depletion which is appropriate for what their bodies actually need in any given space and time. And I think that's definitely true in some contexts, right? So I feel like probably most of us are familiar with the concept of hoarders. And it's pretty clear that most of the time these people are both physically and metaphysically unwell. And whether it's because of, or whether it's conducive to, or whether there's a compounding relationship between their physical and mental and or metaphysical lack of health and the accumulation of things that they don't need, I think it's pretty clear that there's a relationship there, which would confirm what I was asserting as like the primary vector by which some people might do well within capitalism and some people might not. But I feel like the secondary form or the secondary manifestation of this dynamic is that, again, because we end up deriving our sense of the value of a given form of capital based on our projections of what other people might find valuable. I would say that probably like 70% of people and their ability to do well or not do well in capitalism are subject to a dynamic where we overly value money, where we overly value property, where we overly value social capital, such that some people end up unconsciously accumulating those things even when they don't need them based on the space and the time that they're in. And that because we live in a world of limited space and limited time, in the sense that there's only so much attention and awareness that each of us can give, not only based upon the amount of ether or awareness that we can channel in our human vessels, but also based upon the amount of ether or awareness that we can channel due to constraints introduced by karmic accumulation, which takes up space in our awareness. But yeah, I would say that we play a somewhat zero-sum game when it comes to space and time, due to the constraints placed by the karma which informs the development of our physical bodies, and the karma which has accumulated in collective consciousness or mind. And so when people unconsciously accumulate things which they perhaps sometimes errantly believe to be valuable, it takes these things away from other people. And I would say that, again, I think for 70% of people, their ability to succeed or fail in our matrix is probably predominantly influenced by this dynamic. Just pausing to see if things come up in the chat. And I'd say the tertiary dynamic is that, so if the primary dynamic is that we unconsciously accumulate or avoid accumulating things based on context enmeshment, and the secondary dynamic is that we perhaps accumulate or avoid accumulating things based on our projections about what other people find valuable. I would say the tertiary dynamic is that, especially when it comes to social capital, I would say that the interactions and the relationships that we tend to assign value to in any given moment are overly influenced by our perception of how much those people, often based on their physical appearance, but also based on the way they speak and their body language and their proportions and the schools they went to, the countries that they hold citizenship to, so on and so forth. I'd say that our perceptions of those people and their access to capital based on both the primary and the secondary dynamics, which I put forth, ends up influencing how much awareness and attention that we give to those people. And because energy tends to follow awareness or attention, then different forms of capital, primarily money, social capital, and property, end up flowing towards people who are already perceived as having access to those things. And since I've said that rather abstractly, I'll say that mostly we're more eager to give awareness and attention to people who have features like color of skin or length or protrusion of noses or thickness of hair or height, or what we might sometimes call body mass index or thickness or muscularity. We tend to give awareness, and then eventually downstream of that, capital in the form of money, property, and desire to interact towards people who look like people who have been successful throughout the history of humanity. And I think that that tends to be lighter skinned people, tends to be taller people, tends to be people who are like thin and muscular, tends to be people who have bridges in their noses. It tends to be people who have hair all over their heads. And for men, hair all over their bodies, and for women, an absence of hair all over their bodies. And because we're willing to listen to these people, we tend to be influenced by them, and because what they tend to say relates to the transmission of thought forms and thought form complexes, which result in us giving more attention and eventually money and sometimes property to these people, that we end up in these like gravitational attractors, which I feel explain why some people thrive within systems of capitalism, which is to say they thrive within systems of behavior which are influenced by what I would call demons, which cause us to overly value some forms of some forms of some forms of capital in contexts where they're not actually valuable. I think it explains why, to a large extent, certain types of people thrive and other types of people struggle, whether or not the inherent merit of these people and their behaviors in any given context is actually valuable in that context or not. Does anybody have anything to add? Oh, what it says, I'm thinking of morphogenetic fields. Do you want to say more about it?
Yes, thanks for the invitation. As you were speaking about the gravitational fields of both like awareness accumulating because of like specifically in the context of like what people have or like how they look, and then how they're like awarded these different material subsets of markers of success, like land, like money, like access to like gyms to have like a sick body, for example. And
Thick.
and it like just makes me think of how like our environmental field of influence um kind of, I don't know, like some people can tap into it and some people um it's a little bit more veiled for them. And I
Mm,
just, yeah, I guess I'm just kind of wondering about that level of influence or like impact, and how like having awareness of that can sort of change maybe one's relationship to what they are looking to accumulate. Or like, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of also feeling into like my hunter gatherer ancestors. And
shit.
yeah,
The
and just,
savages.
yes, the savages, the heathens of my lineage, God bless them and goddess bless them. And yeah, I'm just kind of wondering if like how, or like I guess mechanistically speaking, I'm kind of just tuning into the possibility that despite our morphogenetic fields, we can kind of hunt um, for resources in life or things that we need to sustain our bodies and our health with more like keenness, um, if we're kind of aware of that karmic accumulation. Like I think about
Mm,
it often where I'm like, I live in this like suburban town where the access is like pretty easy. I have a car. And I also think about how these things impact what I think I need and
mm,
impact also like what I actually need, not only to survive, but to thrive as well.
mm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to integrity, which is something that Lexi mentioned earlier in the chat.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think it's like a simple and kind of boring or like not always helpful answer, right? It's like, yeah, if we're integrated, then we see through the bullshit and it's easier to see what we actually need. Um, and I think that this is like important both for people who are like currently succeeding within systems of capitalism and for people who are currently struggling, right? And I think like it's more obvious for people, to me at least, as somebody who's perhaps from many perspectives struggling within the system of capitalism. I feel fucking great though, but you know, it's like
Ashe.
you don't want to give too much time to people or things or pursuits which are perhaps like not inherently valuable, and you want to give time to things which are valuable. And I think that's probably obvious, right? But then I think that people who are like currently doing pretty well within systems of capitalistic uh, demonicness, it's like, yeah, like you might say like it doesn't really matter because they can undervalue the things which are valuable, and they can overly value the things which aren't valuable, and they're just going to be fine either way. But then I'd say that our environments and the morphogenetic fields in which our environments arise tend to change suddenly, and then you you could say that, like, yeah, people who might have an accumulation of things which are currently defined as valuable might end up holding on to things which are no longer valuable given the changing environment. And then what do you do? Or like, then all of a sudden you're no longer able to rely upon the fact that you look a certain way or that you have a lot of certain thing, and you have to suddenly, in each context, just like the rest of us poor motherfuckers, like define for yourself and see what is actually valuable and give your awareness towards getting that. And I think this speaks to what perhaps like your savage heathen hunter gatherer ancestors might be clamoring about. Is that, yeah, like,
It
you
definitely
know,
does.
we're all going to be scrapping in certain contexts. And I would say that the people who spend a long time integrating and figuring out what's valuable, not based on like egregores of value, but instead based on like what
Right.
their body and what the cosmic beings that their bodies grant them access to define as valuable, probably going to have quite an advantage over the people who've been relying upon accumulations of value and ideas about what is valuable, which may suddenly expire on the shelf. And yeah, I wish everybody well. but,
Ashe.
but I would say that, like, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, I feel like I've spent a lot of time, yeah, mostly clearing broken ideas about what's valuable for my body. But then as that process has unfolded, also not developing newer ideas about what's valuable, but feeling called towards things which sometimes align with things which are currently thought of as valuable and sometimes misalign with things which are currently thought of as valuable. But I would say always bring me an increasing sense of joy and vitality or aliveness. And yeah, I wish everybody well. But I would say that if it comes down to it, I feel I have a lot of faith in my ability not only to figure out what's valuable, but who's valuable. And while I may wish everybody well, I might give more awareness and attention towards people who, in that context, are more valuable to me based on their integrity, based on my sense of their integrity through my own integrity. But I wish everybody well. And I don't think it's like a psychopathic thing to say, but it's just like, I think in some ways it's psychopathic to want to believe that you have the power or the influence to expend, that you can like sacrifice not only your own well-being, but the well-being of who are close to you in order to like virtue signal that you care about everybody. To me, that's also a form of psychopathy. Um, and I think, yeah, it's realistic to believe that in any given context, it's only possible to care so much about so many people. And yeah, the ones who I will care about, my senses in those contexts, the ones that I'll care about are the ones who've, I would say, demonstrated that they're willing to refine themselves. And then if I have spare energy or awareness, I'll extend that boundary outwards. It's not a threat. It's a promise. It's just like, yeah, I just want to be upfront with everybody. Wouldn't want anybody to harbor any false expectations about my time and energy.
Oh,
Why would that? Why would I think that that's even possible? That people might attach to my time and energy and then become disappointed and lash out at me when their expectations end up being completely full of shit. Strange, yeah. I gotta check the chat, really. I'm gonna mute so I can scream. Anna says something feisty about boundaries, which wouldn't make sense, I think, if I quoted it directly, but makes sense, I think, if I just talk about it as boundaries. I'm gonna start setting the sun on that 30-meter / 95-foot by 5-meter / 17-foot container. If you like, you can tune into the songs of birds as the sun's setting and the crescendo of pollinating insects. So thank you to y'all who showed up. I say thank you to my vaster self. Thank you to the lands that I'm occupying, the lands y'all are occupying. Thank you to the people who help us to eat, help us to stay sheltered, help us to drink, help us to get the things that our bodies need in any given context, help us to avoid the things that our bodies don't need in any given context. Say thank you to the stewards of the land who were here long, long ago, helping us to cultivate the land so that we have relatively easy access to those things. Which seems topical given that Thanksgiving just passed in North America or United States of America, because I know that in Canada they celebrate Thanksgiving at a different time. I'm not your all-you-can-eat Ethiopian restaurant. Yeah, give thanks to those who are integrating and demonstrating an appetite for integration / refinement, so that not only can they discern what's valuable to them in any given context, but they can discern how they might be of value to other beings in any given context. And with that, I'll close the container. I'm going to let Craig know that he can leave. I'll say once again that this has been a transmission from the Broom Radio. And good night. Peace. Hamala Shamala. Happy Thanksgiving.